I read Under the Eye of the Big Bird by Hiromi Kawakami. And this is it's the first time that I've read this. It's a series of science fiction short stories all set within the same universe, kind of. I wouldn't say it like it's a novel in the sense that it's fictional, but it's not a novel in the sense of like we're following one psychologically whole character throughout time. Instead, we're kind of examining human society or the evolution of what humanity could become in Kawakami's imagination. Because the timeline that things stretch goes over centuries and it feels like even millennia, kind of starting out, and it's non-linear too. So the way that I want to organize it and talking about it is chronological, but that's not the experience of it in the book. And I think that that's significant for Kawakami's approach because she's unfolding things kind of intellectually and emotionally through the book instead of in a way that we can understand or that is supposed to be like, oh, here is a set of rules for you to understand the unfolding of a historical story. That's not what it feels like she's going for with the book. Instead, I think you're supposed to feel really off balance and kind of taking it in the way that science fiction operates, where you have some element of the society that we recognize as normal is displaced, and then that kind of allows us to re-examine the world that we live in light of that displacement. So in this case, it's kind of like the family is very different. When the story starts out, it's from the perspective of a woman who she's with her second or third husband. I don't exactly remember. And she has several children, but the children are not like born from this relationship of having husbands. Instead, they come from a factory. And each of the children is in some way like genetically derived from various animals and also the husbands as well. And she talks to her friends, in the way that just we usually do as regular people, just kind of gossiping and talking and socializing. And she's like, oh, what kind of animal was your husband? What kind of animal was his past wives? And this kind of thing. And you find out that like the husband that she's married to is derived from a dolphin eventually. And one of her friends has a husband who was derived from a human. And so I'm like, at that point, you're like pretty discombobulated, or I am. Like, how am I even supposed to be imagining these people? Do they look like kind of chimeric animal-human hybrids? How are children coming from a factory? Like, all people come from factories, according to the narrator. And so there's a kind of like Brave New World element to the whole thing. The naming conventions in various stories have a very dystopian kind of like people have numbers instead of names kind of a thing going on. And so Kawakami is like really tearing apart parts of our reality that I think we take for granted so that we can look at them and say like, okay, what is a family really? What is a marriage really? And it comes down to so many times in the various stories, the emotional connections between the different characters. And so in the first story that I'm talking about, where people are kind of like derived from animals, she cares about her children. She loves them. She cares for her husbands. She likes to be with them. She enjoys living with them and like taking care of them, cooking for them, cleaning the house, and how he has an important job and all of this stuff that seems like kind of a normal family life, but all of this other stuff is displaced. And so then it comes into question, like, is that the thing that makes a family? Is that what a marriage is? Is the emotional bonds? Is it the role of, having a homemaker and a breadwinner and emotional connection between adults and children? is that the basis of what a family is? And the rest of the book just keeps asking that question kind of over and over and over and giving various answers. And I'm not sure that there actually is an answer per se, like in air quotes. But it makes me think of the kind of Washa culture that, comes out of China and heavily influences Japanese culture. The kind of like Confucianism that posits that, like the leader of the nation, the king or the emperor is the father of the land and the people are his children, right? And that this is the kind of ideal political relationship that we should have, and that it mirrors a kind of way that the heavens and the gods are our parents or fathers and humanity is their children. So there's a kind of hierarchy of authority. There's a directionality to piety and obedience and love that flows from the authority figure to the protected, children, people. And Kawakami is taking that whole kind of patriarchal system and just like tearing it apart and showing like alien versions of it that reveal the way in which like maybe that sounds good but is actually bizarre. And so, for example, you have like characters in the story who come of age and kind of step outside of society and become these people who are called watchers. And a lot of the watchers are men. And so there's a male kind of disconnection from the rest of society. And their job is to police the edges of society, the kind of edge cases of people who are evolving over the centuries and the millennia to become something that adapts to the changing conditions of the world. Because there's been some kind of like series of catastrophes or ecological disasters. It's very unclear what's going on. But people are adapting in the way that they respond to the whole thing. Like the human population is extremely low at this point. Like people can't even imagine the idea that there were hundreds of thousands of people in a city, let alone, billions and billions of people. So there's like, you're talking about populations in towns and stuff that are in the hundreds, and people can't imagine anything bigger than that. And these communities are like very diverse. They're very different from each other in their approach to survival. And so the men who are the watchers don't actually like intervene very much. They don't have a direct emotional connection. They don't have a direct hierarchical kind of connection in that Washa kind of Confucianism kind of way that I was talking about. There's no one looking up to them. In fact, they are like kind of invisible. And it's much closer to the idea of like the Western Christianity kind of idea of a God who, created the universe and then stepped away from it and allowed it to do its own thing and doesn't intervene in it anymore. Except that every once in a while, these guys do step in and wipe out a population that they feel like is getting too aberrant or is crossing some kind of line that feels distasteful to them. And they do this watching via different animals. They have this kind of like psychic or maybe electronic connection where they're able to displace their consciousness into animals or other like items and then, observe the societies in that way. And so that's where the book gets its title from, Under the Eye of the Big Bird. One of the watchers is, watching things literally through a large bird. And so there's something about that that's like very non-human. Like what makes us human beings? Is it our bodies? Because these guys are able to displace their consciousness into animals. So are they even human anymore? They feel very separate from the rest of humanity. And that question about like what even is human is asked over and over throughout the stories. So I think it's very like she wants us to be thinking about that as readers, and this capability that the Watchers have is one of the ways in which she's pulling at like what makes us human. Is it families? Is it the structure of society? Is it our bodies? Is it the relationships that we have with each other? And the answer is kind of like all of those things. And how much of any of that can we subtract at a given time until like what's the limit at which we stop being human if we subtract enough of those things? The other big thing in the story or set of stories that revolves around gender is the mothers, who again are like this non-human but also very human construction. So they show up in many, many of the stories, and near the end of the book, you find out what the mothers are exactly, or the mother, I guess. So like many of the people are raised by mother throughout the story, and it's clear that like not only are they disparate in time, but also in place. So these mothers are kind of like all over the place, and they have human bodies, but they don't seem to age. They don't have very much emotional depth. They're very like kind of robotic, and they remind me of like the Stepford Wives, right? This idea of like an ideal woman who doesn't have needs of her own, like ideal in a kind of nightmare sense of like the patriarchy has an idea of what a mother should be like, and that is what these things are. They don't feel totally human. They have a deep capacity to nurture and love, but that's it. They don't have needs of their own necessarily. They don't, like if you mistreat them, they don't get mad about it. They don't feel like they need rights, and they have no kind of existential dread. There's no relationship that they have with death or existence, because they seem to persist through time, and they have a collective consciousness across all of the bodies that they inhabit. And so there, in a sense, there's like one mother, but she has many, many bodies. And she has nothing to do necessarily with giving birth, because there are many characters that we have the perspective of who become pregnant and give birth to babies, but they are not included in the group that we call the mothers. And in fact, the mothers take care of these women who have babies, and they take care of the babies, and they take care of the men who get the women pregnant. So there's like, what is a mother at that point, right? Like the title of mother is referring to some other kind of non-human entity that, like I said, at the end, we kind of get the perspective of this thing, and it's a hybrid consciousness of AI and human bodies, but with no intellect. So it really is like that kind of Stepford wife thing, but multiplied, by the thousands, and put out there not as a product, but as a caretaker, as a buffer and a boundary, in the same way that the Watchers are. And so to me, it seems like you have this construction of like, there's this male group of the Watchers, there's this female group of the mothers, and they are fostering this type of humanity that is changing into something that we, the reader, cannot recognize as human, but that we nonetheless can connect to intellectually and emotionally throughout the stories. And so you have characters who have capabilities to like read minds and have like deep psychic empathy. They can tell what other people are feeling. they can take on those feelings themselves. Or you have other characters who their skin is like greenish and they have kind of vegetable cells in them, and they're able to go out into the sun and collect sunlight and photosynthesize instead of having to eat. And they even go so far as to like produce fruits and vegetables from their body that they offer up to other people to be eaten. And then they in turn will eat from other people as well, in a kind of like, it's a weird cannibalism thing, but it's also somehow like sexually productive. And it's just like, it's really bizarre. Like it makes you rethink, like, what does it mean to have sex? And like, that's a kind of gross thing if you're thinking about it from this perspective of taking in substances from other people. That's not usually the way that we think about that. But the character thinks about this exchange of body, fruit, and vegetables as being very emotionally gratifying and totally normal. And so, like I said, it does the thing that science fiction does of pulling apart what we normally assume to be normal and then causing us to like question everything that we assume about that and kind of re-examine the world. There's a lot of like the tone of a lot of the stories is funny, I guess. I don't know another word for it. Like I've found myself laughing a lot of times, but not in a way that like, oh, this is jokey, or it's kind of like a situation comedy where this situation is cringy and embarrassing and I'm laughing at the characters or anything like that. It's funny because it's so weird, but the characters are so deadpan and not thinking that it's weird at all. They're just like, yeah, whatever. Sometimes I eat somebody's arm. Sometimes they eat my arm. It's totally normal. Who cares? Yeah, I've been alive for 400 years. So what? Things like that. And so like the writing style feels very alien. But at the same time, it's very easy to take in. And therefore, I think like you're able to connect with it as a reader and step into these very different shoes and understand the perspective of the character while feeling like it is a very alien and weird experience. But it's so matter of fact, so down to earth that there's a kind of ironic humor to the whole thing, which honestly is like very characteristic of Kawakami's writing style, like in her other work that I've encountered. And the story is really not concerned in a typically science fiction way with like quote unquote progress necessarily. Like so many science fiction stories they'll be set in the future, maybe the near future, maybe the timeline goes over thousands of years the way that this book does. But those thousands of years will include some idea or anxiety around progress. So maybe the story will be a kind of post-apocalyptic thing, which this story feels like it has that element of it, that society has collapsed in some way. But the story doesn't care about that in a way that I find science fiction often does. And so like usually you'll read something and it's post-apocalyptic and the story is like very anxious about the loss of technology, the loss of human power over nature. And the rest of the story will be about the recovery of that, or that some characters are special because their relationship puts them back on track, or they have transcended that loss of technological prowess. And if the story takes place over thousands of years, it shows a way in which progress, quote unquote, is reestablished and reasserted by the society. Or you have other stories in which scientific progress never stops. There's a linear progression. And we, not only do we go into outer space, but we start to command time and space itself and create whole new realities and on like that. We redefine our biological destiny through conscious choice. And all of this kind of like technology gives us limitless possibilities in the future. This science fiction story is not looking at linear progression at all. Instead, progression is happening on a kind of geological and evolutionary basis. The forces of biology and geology are the primary forces at play and not the human intellect driving forward technological development. And in fact, with the mothers and the watchers, if anything, they're keeping a very conservative lid on the progression, quote unquote, of human technology, and even the advancement, if you want to call it that, of society. There's just certain ways in which it's almost like humanity is a garden. There's ways in which they're pruning back these elements of societal development that they don't want to manifest for whatever reason. We don't find out why there are so few people anymore. And the answer to the question could even be because of this emergent structure of the mothers and watchers. Maybe they, catastrophically cut down the population in a massive way because that is the society that they're building. But it doesn't feel as sinister as that or as deliberate as that even. It just is like in the chapter about the mother and the emerging AI, she talks about the way in which the relationship that people have to technology is a kind of like deferment of priority and like preference, that you just give up agency to computers because it's easier. And there wasn't even like necessarily a fight for dominance or the future. There was just a kind of relaxing into leisure that then became the society that we see in the book. And that there was a sense, like a kind of psychological, unconscious sense of inevitability to the progression of AI, of creating something that could think as deeply and complexly as humans. Because like some of the chapters that have to do with like mind reading and stuff that talk about sweeping through the consciousness of other people around them and delving deep down to the point of the unconscious and all of the kind of swirling emotions and uncontrollable reactions that people have, and the way in which that is the majority of the human mind. And so it feels like the mother is kind of saying that AI kind of came from those unknowable depths in a way that the conscious mind had a desire to be reined in and kind of like hedged in protection against that unknowability, and in a way that where it didn't have to take care of itself anymore. And so the mother steps in and takes care of humanity as a species and a society. And then every once in a while, there are characters who really, really push against that and ask all kinds of questions and want to know more, and they want to explore. And that's when the watchers step in and like eliminate those edge case people in a really chilling way, because like those are usually the heroes of science fiction stories, right? And novels and whatnot. That would be like the main character, the exceptional person that we get to step into the shoes of as the reader and then have a heroic adventure with them. Those people are just wiped out every once in a while. And so that's why I say that it's like a garden. It feels like humanity has become this very domesticated version of itself, but examined from a societal level. So it's a fascinating book with a really weird structure that doesn't necessarily have a coherent story per se, like an arc overall, but instead creates like a picture that's very thought-provoking and just weird. It's just really weird, but entertaining and yeah, and really good. I don't know, everything that I read by Kawakami. Just fascinating. Really, really interesting. Always very different.